that, I will hand it over to you, Denise.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Just a little addition to what Ronnie said about asking questions on my FYI. All 3 sessions have been recorded, and you can ask questions about any of them. I usually check the site almost every day, but at least once a week for any questions that people may have. But so far, there haven't been any questions. So if you do have any, please go ahead and post them, and I will answer them as quickly as possible. And on that note, I'll go ahead and do the 3rd and final session that I'll be responsible for, which is just an overview of federal HR. This particular session, we're going to talk about retaining employees. First session, we gave a general overview. Second session, we talked about classification and staffing. And in this session, we'll talk a little bit about how to retain our employees that we have on board. So Jennifer, if you want to move on, we can. Thank you. I include this particular slide in all 3 sessions just because it's a very good reminder for everyone about where we get our federal HR policy. It really comes from this particular slide, shows 2 different places, but it's really a 3rd place that I'll talk about. Congress legislates laws, the president signs executive orders. Those particular things go into the Office of Personnel Management, who's responsible for setting the overall rules and regulations for how Title V, competitive service, federal HR works. The 3rd particular place is down in that bottom left-hand corner of the slide. Periodically, the courts will issue decisions that affect how we do federal HR. And we can move on from there and talk about the last, Jennifer, if you want to switch the slide, please. We can talk about our last block, which is retaining employees. In this particular session, we'll talk about performance management and things like managing performance problems, handling conduct situations, and quality of work life. So we can move on, please. We'll talk about now what performance management is. Many of us just think it's appraising employees, giving them performance ratings, but it is much more than that. It includes setting the goals and planning the work of the organization, both with the employees and management at the beginning of the year, but it should also apply to the whole year. Frequently, projects change, new work comes in, other things become less important. So those setting goals and planning is a continuous thing through the year, not one and done. It also includes measuring our progress towards those goals, towards those performance standards during the course of the year. Giving feedback. The supervisor should provide performance feedback to the employees during the course of the year so that the employees have an idea of how they're doing. But also the employees should be giving feedback to managers, because sometimes we realize, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, that the goals are unrealistic. So that feedback works 2 ways. We also need, in performance management, to consider developing employee skills. And we'll see this means things like training, on-the-job training, as well as formal training, etc. And then performance management also includes using rewards to recognize behaviors and the results that employees achieve. We can move on, Jennifer, thank you. And we'll talk now about some of the supervisory responsibilities. Supervisors have a responsibility not only to set standards, and usually those are developed in coordination with the employees, but they also have to communicate those performance standards to the employees. It's very important, and it's one of the things that supervisors don't like to do, and that is to tell employees when their performance is falling short. It's critical that's done because, as we'll see, if there is a performance problem, it is necessary for those unacceptable performance elements to be pointed out to the employee during the course of the performance year, and not just to hit them with it when it's time to do the formal performance appraisals. If performance is unacceptable, supervisors have a responsibility to set a course of action so the employee can reach an acceptable level of performance. However, if that doesn't happen, they have to be prepared to take performance-based actions if necessary. And it's very important for supervisors to work with their HR advisors, especially when the performance is not meeting the minimum levels. Okay, next, please. Now, performance plans and performance standards should lay a foundation for the work. What work is expected to be accomplished during the course of the year, and how well that work should be accomplished. I always say that performance plans tell employees what is expected of them, and it tells the supervisors what they can expect from that employee in terms of performance. So it's a two-way street. The performance plan should provide focus on the work that is to be accomplished during the course of a performance year, serve as an agreement between the employee and the supervisor. And by an agreement, I mean they agree on what work is to be accomplished, how well it's to be accomplished, and in what time frame it's to be accomplished. So when the supervisor and the employee discuss and agree to those standards, it is a formal agreement between the two of them on what's going to be done. But they should also be, those performance plans, a working document. As I said before, work changes during the course of the year. New requirements come in, old requirements become less important. Sometimes we get new IT that comes in, new programs that have to come in that we need to start working on or changing the way we do work. So those performance plans should be a working document, and then when changes to the work occurs, then the performance plan should be altered to now meet the current requirements that are taking place. Okay, next, please. I want to just mention the difference between a performance element and a performance standard. The performance elements are telling the employees what they have to do. The performance standards tell the employees how well they need to do it. Both of these are to reach acceptable performance, which obviously is the goal. And we really want our employees not just to meet their expectations, but to exceed their expectations. So when we set those standards, we're telling the employee how well they need to do it in order to meet the minimum requirements of their performance standards. Next slide, Jennifer, please. I don't know why, whenever I start instructing on this, my voice gets a little hoarse. It happened the last session as well. But in order for employees to understand whether or not they are reaching an acceptable level of performance, we have to monitor that performance during the course of the year. And there are very few supervisors if any, that I've come across in the course of my career where the supervisor liked monitoring performance and doing performance appraisals. Most of them hate it because a lot of times we're not passing good news on to the employees. And it's easy for the supervisors to tell the employees when they're doing really well. It's much harder to tell them when they're not doing well. But it is critical that supervisors monitor employees' performance during the course of the year, because it allows them to assess whether or not the employees are meeting their standards. If they are not, to assist them in correcting that unacceptable performance, and also to make changes to any unrealistic or problematic standards, and also to make changes if there's been a change in the work. Sometimes when we set those standards in the beginning of a performance year, we might be setting a new standard and we don't understand that the work is more complicated than we expect it to be, and therefore the standard becomes unrealistic, etc. So monitoring the performance during the course of the year helps us to fix these things. Next slide, please. When supervisors are monitoring performance, there are really two types of feedback they can give to the employees. The first, positive feedback, supervisors are much happier to give. The second, constructive feedback, is when they have a little bigger problem. Our positive feedback is an acknowledgement that the performance meets or exceeds the expectation, but constructive feedback is very critical if the employee is not meeting their standards. It's an explanation of how the performance does not meet the expectations, and also the steps that can be taken to correct or improve that performance. Supervisors cannot take performance-based actions against employees for not meeting their performance standards if they haven't provided this constructive feedback and means to help the employee achieve those performance standards. So constructive feedback, if the employee is not meeting their performance standards, is critical to the process. Next slide, please. When we talk about how we can help employees to achieve those performance standards when they're falling short, we're talking about things like training, both formal and on-the-job training, assignments that introduce new skills or provide more responsibility, but also improving work processes. Frequently, we find when an employee isn't meeting their standard, it's not because they're not trying or they don't want to perform well. It's because there can be a lack of training. Sometimes it's something as simple as, and I've heard this many times over the years, an employee is distracted by other employees in the organization. Now, many of our employees now are working at home. There's distractions at home as well as distractions in the office. Years ago, I had one case where an employee was falling short of their performance standards, but it was because another employee who was a high achiever and could get the work done easily spent a lot of their day talking to the employee that then could not meet their performance standards because they were being distracted during the course of the day. So the developing of performance is very critical, because if the employee isn't meeting their performance standards, the supervisor needs to find out why. Is it a work process that has to be improved? Sometimes the employee does not have the right skills. In this particular case, it wasn't a work process, but a work situation where we had to pretty much separate the employees, but talk to the high achiever and say, you're holding somebody else back. Sit at your desk and stop distracting them. So, these particular development of performances can be very critical, especially when the performance isn't up to par. Okay, let's talk a little bit about rewarding performance on the next slide. Rewarding performance, it can include a cash award, time off, honorary recognition, such as employee of the quarter, employee of the year, whatever. But also sometimes we find that the final one, informal recognition, is very important to employees. That's when a supervisor stands up at a staff meeting and compliments an employee or points out maybe some positive feedback they've gotten from another organization for that employee. Obviously, the first one, cash, is very important to all of us. None of us are working because we like to work. We're working because we like the cash. And that's very true of rewarding performance as well. However, I want to point out that especially for those of us who work in organizations where there is pay banding, performance becomes very important because the performance appraisal reflects how much pay increase the individual is going to get. So performance monitoring, appraising, rating becomes very, very important when an organization is using pay banding, because their level of performance has a direct influence on their increase in pay. Okay, and those of you who work in organizations that are pay banded should know that already. Okay, let's move on. We're going through these quickly. Nobody has a question, comment, anything? Okay. One of the things that we need to do is to distinguish when we have a performance problem and when we have a misconduct problem, because the process for dealing with misconduct is very different from the process of dealing with a performance issue. Performance problems are when an employee fails to perform the duties of their position at an acceptable level. In other words, they are not meeting their performance standards. However, we find that there are some cases where it's not that the employee can't perform at an acceptable level, it's that they don't want or refuse to perform at an acceptable level. That is misconduct, not performance. Misconduct is when an employee fails or refuses to comply with a rule, a regulation, or a requirement, whether that requirement is a requirement to work a certain number of hours or a requirement in their performance standards. So there's a very distinct difference between when we have a performance problem, when the employee can't perform at an acceptable level. That's when things like training, improving work processes, those types of things become very important. Misconduct, on the other hand, is when an employee refuses to do their work at an acceptable level. They have the tools, they have the capacity, the work process is there, the time is there, but they choose not to do the work. They choose not to do it. So it is the failure or refusal to comply with a rule, regulation, or requirement. Very distinct process for handling the two situations for a supervisor. And that's when it's very important for us as HR people to make sure we kind of dig down into the situation to determine whether we have performance or misconduct. In both cases, it is incumbent upon the supervisor to inform the employee all along when they're not meeting their performance or when they're disobeying a rule, regulation, or requirement. Both of them require the supervisor to inform the employee of the situation as soon as they see it develop, hopefully. Many times supervisors wait until it becomes a very serious issue and then they want to take action. And because they've kind of waited, they get really upset about the situation and they want to take really severe action where we have to kind of build up the types of actions that we'll take. So, important distinction. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about that misconduct when the employee won't follow that rule, regulation, or requirement. There are some things that we as HR people need to advise management about. And that is, we have to make sure that the facts of the conduct establish the behavior. Did the employee do this? Is it clear cut that this behavior took place? Did the behavior violate rules, regulations, or requirements? Next one is very, very important. Were the rules, regulations, or requirements communicated to the employee? We can't expect employee to know things if we don't tell them. So we have to make sure that the manager communicates with the employee about the rules, regulations, and requirements. And finally, has the rule, regulation, or requirement been enforced consistently? By that, I mean, say we're upset with an employee because they get 30 minutes for lunch and every day they take an hour for lunch. So we communicate with the employee and tell them, you know, you're taking long for lunch every day. You need to put leave in or to abide by the 30-minute rule. But we should also find out if there's a reason. Do they have a legitimate reason for doing that? And can any accommodation be made if they have a legitimate reason? But we explain all of that to the employee. And then the employee comes back with, well, Jane Doe, who you really like, takes an hour every day for lunch. Do you say anything to her? And if the employee doesn't, then the rule hasn't been enforced consistently, and we don't have a cause for taking any action. So it is important when we want to communicate a misconduct type action to an employee that we find out whether or not the employee knows and we've communicated with the employee, but also whether or not that rule, regulation, or requirement is enforced consistently. And pretty much when these things advance, it has to be forced consistently across the organization, not just within a little office. The supervisor next to the supervisor we're dealing with lets their employees take an hour every day and doesn't say anything. And we want to hold our employees to that hour. There needs to be consistency and conversation with those managers about what the rule, regulations, and requirements are and how they do need to be enforced consistently throughout the organization. Okay. Any questions about misconduct? Because I want to move on to quality of work life. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about something that's very important to many of us in our lives. And that is a quality of work life initiatives. And a lot of these have really come to the forefront with the pandemic. But why is quality of work life becoming so important? And it's because many of us have increased responsibilities and pressures. And what we find now, and I personally hate this term, but we have an aging federal workforce. And I hate that term because I'm already aged, not aging. But the aging federal workforce now not only has responsibility for children and in many cases grandchildren, but we also find that they have responsibilities for parents. And that really increases the pressure on employees so that sometimes it can affect their work. And because of that, we have these quality of work life initiatives that we'll talk about in just a second. The nature of our workforce has changed. We have people that are more knowledgeable about the rules, regulations, more knowledgeable about what's happening in private industry in terms of quality of work life initiatives. And we also have a workforce that is not adverse to leaving the federal government and going to private industry. Many years ago, our workforce stayed consistently within the federal government. And as a matter of fact, when I went to work for the federal government many, many years ago, My dad used to say to me, get a job in the federal government. You'll always have a job and you never have to leave until you're ready to retire. That was true until I got riffed, but that was another story. But the workforce now is geared not to just coming into the federal government and staying for their full career. And in many cases, people stayed in the same agency their whole career. But people come and go in the federal government. And indeed, we've made it easier for them to come and go. And that's okay. That's kind of what we want. We don't want a workforce that's going to come in, take a job, stay stagnant in that job. We want employees that are willing to move and change, advance themselves, etc. Also, what's causing the quality of work-life initiatives to change is, Jen, somebody is not muted. Can we make sure that everybody is muted, please?
Your mic muted?
I don't know. Somebody, I just hear somebody not muted. Okay. But anyway, also now changing our quality of work life is the availability of network technology. And indeed, especially in FYI, we all know about that. Many of us, like me, I work at home. I'm not near the DC area. So because of network technology, I'm able to perform my work at home, as many of us are able to do. So that has that has changed how we achieve our work, and has contributed to our quality of work life initiatives. If we can go to our final slide, please. And that is, what are some of our quality of work life initiatives? Alternate work schedules. And indeed, I work an alternate work schedule. Many of us do. And within our federal agencies, many people are working alternate work schedules, whether it's a 5-4-9 schedule, whether it is a 10-hour day schedule, etc., whether they come in at 6 and leave at 2:30, whatever. But people are working many different work schedules. Telework. I'm working teleworking. Many federal employees telework. They, if they telework now, they're required to have a telework agreement that sets forth when they are expected to work and the requirements of achieving that work. We also have employee assistance programs, and these have become very important, as well as the health and wellness programs during the pandemic. The employee assistance programs became very important. Well, they've always been important, but they became really critical during the pandemic, because people were, everybody, not just employees, everybody was under a lot of pressure. A lot of mental health issues came about. Just the fact, mental health issues, those people who were trying to get work done, but also had young children at home that all of a sudden had to be homeschooled. It really put pressure on people that, to a degree that we had not seen before. So our employee assistance programs became very, very critical during the pandemic and have remained so. Health and wellness programs. Many agencies allow employees to have a certain number of hours per week where they can participate in health and wellness programs. And indeed, many of the federal buildings, if not all of them now, all of the major buildings have gyms that the employees can go to, detailed in the access to fitness facilities. If they don't, some organizations have monetary, I guess, payment, if you will, of access to fitness facilities for employees. The final two things that we offer, and usually they come under the EAP, is financial counseling and legal assistance to employees. The legal assistance does not, for example, if you want to write a will, for example, it does not normally write the will for you, but we'll tell you where to go to get that done. Same thing if you have a car accident and you want an attorney for your car accident, the legal assistance isn't going to provide the attorney, but it will counsel you as to where to go and what to do to find help with those particular things. So those are just some of the quality of work life things that we offer to employees now in order to retain them. And that's kind of the end of the slides. We're pretty quick today. Questions, comments, anything? Anything about anything we've talked about in any of the 3 sessions if you attended all 3? Don't be shy.
If you guys, if you don't think of your questions today, that was a lot of awesome information. Feel free to, watch the sessions on my FYI, and then also put those questions there or in the chat.
Okay, if we don't have any questions, I will thank you all for attending and wish you all a very happiest of New Year's and happy holidays, no matter what holiday you celebrate. I hope you all enjoy it. Anything else, Ron, you want to add?
Yeah. I just want to let everybody know that, keep your eyes on your email to see the recording of this posted on my FYI. We're going to be putting a lot of important company updates on my FYI. So if you're having any trouble logging in, please let us know, and we'll make sure that you can get in there. We're doing giveaways on there. There's like life at my FYI. And also keep your eyes on your email for next year. We're going to have a series that's diving deep into classification. And one of our SMEs from Coast Guard, Stephanie Felipe Parker, will be hosting that series. And additionally, we'll have a session on the basics of federal contracting as a contractor. What do companies like FYI do? What are the different types of contracts and ops and optioneers and all that fun stuff by our very own Steve Ketchum. So we're going to have a lot of great stuff coming up. And echoing what he said, if we don't talk, happy holidays. We appreciate all of you, and thank you so much for joining today. All right, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very